While some places are designed around observation, visibility, and control, others are constructed with a very different intention. These are spaces meant to separate and to gradually erase a person's presence from the world beyond their walls. In these places, attention is not focused on watching life unfold, but on ensuring that it disappears from view altogether. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was conceived as a solution, a way to organize illness, behavior, and fear into something manageable. With the original intention of a home away from home, what this asylum became was far from it. Locked doors replaced conversation, and patients were treated as inmates. Treatment became routine, but what that treatment turned into was far beyond disturbing. This is a building that feels clinical and imposing, a massive stone structure designed to endure. But when daytime activity fades, the space changes. Sound lingers longer than expected. Empty rooms feel occupied by the patients that once piled into a single room, looking for somewhere to heal. I'm Johnny Clash, a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to persuade belief or disbelief. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is often remembered as a hospital for the mentally insane, but that label does not quite capture its full reality. It was designed to restore order, but through unorthodox and old-fashioned methods that today would be considered torture. This episode is not focused on proving what remains or even naming it. It's about examining what happens when people are reduced to numbers, and the uneasy details get swept under the rug or hidden to only be revealed years later. Trans-Allegheny does not announce its background story, but it reveals it slowly the longer you look. And the longer you sit down with the uncomfortable information, the harder it becomes to tell where the documented history ends and something else begins. Life in the mid-1800s was harsh, and care for the mentally ill was often harsher, as you can tell by the name of the asylum itself. What would become the Lunatic Asylum began in the early 1850s as Weston State Hospital, built to house and treat patients in a world that had few answers and even fewer comforts for the ill. This all came to be during a period when the United States was actively rethinking how mental illness should be treated. The site chosen in Weston, West Virginia was meant to serve as a centralized facility to treat patients all across the region. From the beginning, the project was ambitious in both size and philosophy, taking up a colossal 242,000 square feet with 13 buildings on a 666-acre plot of land. Yes, 666. This building has no small footprint. The building followed the Kirkbride plan, an architectural approach developed by Thomas Story Kirkbride. His ideas centered on the belief that environment played a major role in recovery, and early on, that's exactly what it did here. Patients were meant to live in orderly, well-lit spaces with access to fresh air, working hours, and freedom of movement across the grounds. The hospital was designed to feel more like a self-contained community rather than a prison, and way early on, this approach did seem promising. While the ideology for Trans-Allegheny seemed to work at first, construction was interrupted in 1858 when the Civil War reached the region. Union soldiers halted progress and used the land and the partially built structure for military purposes. When the work eventually resumed, the hospital opened in stages, finally welcoming patients during the 1860s. At that time, the facility was built to house roughly 250 individuals, each with their own private room. And for a brief period, that's the way the hospital largely operated. Now, as the years passed, admissions increased at an alarming rate that the institution could not manage. By the late 19th century, the number of patients had doubled, then tripled, without corresponding expansions in staff or resources. Conditions began to deteriorate as rooms designed for one person were forced to hold several. Hallways and common spaces were repurposed as sleeping areas, and cages were placed for individuals to stay. Yes, cages, like rabid animals. Eventually, overcrowding had reached extreme levels. Records indicate that by the late 1930s, the hospital was operating at more than 6 times its original capacity. This strain led to shortages of food, clothing, and medical attention, with staff running around not able to manage what they were truly there to do. With the overcrowding and neglect on not only the patients, the structure itself began to decay, with mold growing on windows, walls peeling, and heating systems failing during the winter months. Part of the overcrowding stemmed from how loosely the term mental illness was applied. While many patients did suffer from psychological conditions, others were admitted for physical illnesses such as tuberculosis, like we saw with Waverly Hills, or even just asthma. Some were institutionalized for social reasons, especially women were targeted, including defying a spouse, period cramps, reading too much, being too religious or not enough religious, or expressing political unrest. Imagine that in today's climate. By the 1950s, the population peaked at around 2,600 patients, and some of them were not friendly. The third floor of the asylum housed the most violent men, all in the same room. Could you imagine what went on in there? Not only was the staff scared, but newcomers were also introduced to violence and neglect immediately. Some of them not even in there for a real reason. During this era, aggressive and experimental treatments became routine. Lobotomies were performed in large numbers, often using crude methods that caused permanent damage or death. Other treatments include insulin-induced comas, electroconvulsion therapy, and heavy use of early psychiatric medicines that left patients sedated rather than healed. One of the most brutal was hydrotherapy, where the subject would be placed under high-walled bathtubs filled with freezing cold water for extended periods ranging from hours up to several days. These procedures reflected the medical thinking of the time, but often stripped patients of autonomy and identity. One of the most disturbing cases involved Dr. Walter Freeman, a man seeking notoriety by using an ice pick to perform 2,500 of his 3,500 lobotomies. Often referred to as the lobotomist, he was not a trained surgeon, though he did perform all of these procedures, even on children as young as 4 years old. Freeman treated the operation as a solution rather than a last resort, moving quickly, publicly, and without regard for long-term consequences. Patients were altered permanently, often left unable to care for themselves, while Freeman gained the attention, the lectures, and the headlines that he wanted, and of course, the money to go with it. It was experimentation framed as progress, but when you were sent to the medical center on the property to recover, that basically meant game over. As mental health care evolved and public opinion shifted, large institutions like Trans-Allegheny fell out of favor. Funding declined, patient populations were reduced, and the hospital struggled to justify its continued operation. In 1994, after more than a century of use, the hospital officially closed its doors. After closure, the building stood largely abandoned. The only significant addition after its operational years was a cemetery where many former patients were buried, often under numbered markers rather than names. But over time, the site was preserved and reopened for tours. Today, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum exists as both a museum and a symbol. Its history reflects changing attitudes towards mental health care and control. What began as an optimistic experiment gradually became a cautionary example of what happens when systems outgrow compassion. The building remains, holding the weight of thousands of lives that passed through its corridors, many of them never truly leaving. The cultural identity of Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum did not change all at once. It shifted gradually, shaped by distance from its original function and by the growing need to reinterpret places that no longer fit comfortably into modern life. Once its doors were no longer used for care or confinement, the building entered a new phase where meaning was assigned rather than enforced. The structure stopped representing treatment and instead came to represent the consequences of certainty. What happens when a system believes it has the right answers? The asylum now stands as a reminder of how authority, fear, and incomplete understanding can reshape lives without visible violence. Paranormal media played a major role in this transition. Ghost investigation videos and television series reframed the asylum not as a medical site but as a place where emotional residue might remain. Residual energy. Online platforms accelerated this shift. Short-form videos, overnight investigations, and personal reaction footage brought the asylum into a new generation of storytelling and deeming it the most haunted place in America. These creators often spoke less about what happens there and more about how it felt to stand inside. The unease, the pressure, silence. Listening to their emotions, allowing audiences to project their own interpretation onto the space. Even without knowing the specific stories, visitors often describe a sense of heaviness or alertness. The building does not invite relaxation and never really did, even when it was open. Its scale, acoustics, and isolation encourage inward focus, which can amplify perception and heighten emotional response. That reaction alone for many is to believe something still remains. The asylum now exists as a cultural mirror. Skeptics, believers, historians, and now thrill seekers all enter the same space and leave with different conclusions. That flexibility is part of its power. It does not demand belief, but it rewards the attention it's receiving. Each visit becomes a personal interpretation layered onto thousands of others. But when you first walk into this building, it looks wide. It looks empty. It doesn't look that bad. But as you go deeper, as you make rights and lefts and go upstairs, that's when you see it in a different way. What draws people back is not just the idea of spirits, but the sense that the building remembers. Not in a literal way, but in how it holds everything in. Pop culture reinforced this image by repeatedly placing the asylum along other locations associated with mystery and unresolved energy. Lists of haunted places, horror-themed travel features, seasonal programming positioned it as a destination rather than a cautionary tale. Over time, the label of haunted became a cultural shorthand for something deeper and less definable. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum has become a recurring fixture in paranormal television and even movies, often used as a proving ground rather than a backdrop. Movies such as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or Season 2 of American Horror Story Asylum reinforced these details in much more dramatic manner. But the horror shown on the screen was nothing compared to what really went down. Series like Ghost Adventures framed the location as emotionally reactive. Other shows such as Destination Fear and Paranormal Lockdown leaned into the endurance-based investigations. Overnight lockdowns emphasized how the buildings changed when observation stretches for hours. Paranormal Lockdown was able to capture a shadow figure in the back of their footage.
What the is that?
It's like, that's why I said it's like a snake.
Yeah.
I'm shaking right now just looking at it. You could hear it.
While Destination Fear also revealed an unidentified figure flying past their screen while looking at a thermal camera. Beyond television, Trans-Allegheny has become a staple of long-form YouTube investigations. Independent creators frequently reference the asylum as a benchmark location, one that tests credibility because of how many people have already filmed there and how many have already caught evidence. Instead of trying to replicate earlier moments, many creators document personal reactions, extended silences, and unedited walkthroughs, with EVP sessions going off the charts. This has shifted the pop culture role of the asylum from spectacle to endurance appearance. Even ghost hunters return to Trans-Allegheny for their 200th investigation. Much like many of the other haunted places we have covered here on this podcast, legends surrounding Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum tend to focus less on spectacle and more on recognition. According to accounts shared by the site's current caretakers, there are several recurring presences that staff and visitors come to know over time rather than encounter once. Rebecca Jordan, whose family took ownership of the property, has described her earliest experience not as frightening but personal. During a tour, she felt a firm grip on her shoulder, not aggressive, but unmistakably deliberate. Moments like that set the tone for how many describe the activity here. It feels interactive, aware, and responsive rather than random. Many investigators suggest that understanding what patients endured makes communication more likely, not because the spirits are summoned, but because attention and empathy seem to invite response. The building contains areas where activity is reported consistently, suggesting that certain experiences may be tied to specific memories rather than roaming entities. The suffering that once occurred here did not vanish when the doors closed. It appears to have settled into the structure itself, just like Waverly Hills and Eastern State Penitentiary. And speaking of Waverly Hills, much like Timmy inside the sanatorium, Trans-Allegheny also has a childlike presence. On the 4th floor is a space commonly referred to as Lily's room. Visitors often describe seeing a young girl in a white dress with dark hair, and many leave toys or stuffed animals along the windowsill as an informal tribute. The room is frequently cited as one of the more active areas of the asylum, with reports that include a male presence said to linger near or behind the door, perhaps protecting Lily. What is less clear is who Lily actually was. One theory suggests the figure represents a young 9-year-old patient who passed away, while others claim a patient secretly gave birth within the asylum and the child's spirit never left. Neither account is supported by hospital records, leaving Lily's identity unresolved, but if you ever make the visit, you might just encounter her. One of the most frequently discussed locations is a room on the 3rd floor, known for seclusion cells, chaining patients to the wall and housing the most violent men, where a patient was killed by fellow inmates during a period of extreme overcrowding. They now call this Dean's room. Dean was a relatively calm 14-year-old who was sent to Trans-Allegheny after being accused of killing animals on his family farm. This room housed not only Dean but also 2 other inmates, James Woods, who is often referred to as Big Jim, and David Mason. What they did to Dean was absolutely reprehensible. They tied a sheet around Dean's neck, using it as a noose, and they would lift him off the ground just to the point where he was blue in the face. And then they would slowly bring him back down. But the fun for them ended when they propped the bedpost on top of Dean's face and jumped on the bed until it went straight through his skull. While they were both charged with murder, the duo remained at Trans-Allegheny to serve the remainder of their time. Big Jim is one of those entities named today and still roams the halls of Trans-Allegheny as an evil demonic spirit, just as he was during his time alive. The 2nd floor contains what is often referred to as the most talked about room in the asylum, a small bathroom tied to one of its most violent incidents, if you could believe there was something more violent than Dean's death. According to records and later retellings, a patient made repeated sexual advances towards another patient. After being ignored multiple times, a butter knife was used to stab him 17 times. But he did not die in the bathroom. He collapsed and crawled his way into the hallway where he died, leaving the incident permanently associated with that section of the floor. This area is also linked to a figure commonly called the Sly Man. Witnesses describe a male presence that appears briefly, disappears, and is then reported elsewhere almost immediately. Some claim he could be experienced in multiple locations on the 2nd floor at the same time, moving in ways that do not follow physical space or distance. The 4th floor is often cited as the area with the highest concentration of shadow figure reports. Visitors and investigators describe dark shapes moving along walls, crossing doorways, and appearing briefly before just vanishing. One presence in particular has earned the nickname the Creeper, described as a tall, thin figure that moves unnaturally, sometimes crawling up the walls and across ceilings rather than walking. This is where the footage from Paranormal Lockdown captured a slithering movement on this floor that many point to when discussing this reputation. Now, while the Creeper is also tied to Waverly Hills Sanatorium, many suspect that there is a portal tying these two haunted locations together. Now, Ward R carries its own weight. A woman once reported visible claw-like marks forming across her face while inside the ward, with no clear physical explanation. Others have described seeing a shadow figure framed in a window, rocking slowly back and forth as if seated just out of reach. These experiences tend to focus less on sound and more on visual awareness, the sense of something occupying a space where nothing should be. Room 13 can also be labeled as one of the most haunted rooms on the floor. The door is known to open and close on its own, sometimes repeatedly, even when no one is nearby. Whether these events are tied to a specific incident or to the cumulative history of the ward itself remains unclear. What stands out is how often different people, unaware of their stories, report the same movements and shapes in the same places. Now, we mentioned the torture, we mentioned the healing, but isolation rooms generate some of the most intense reactions. Staff historically had broad authority to place patients into seclusion, often under stressful and understaffed conditions. These rooms are now associated with physical sensations reported by visitors, including pressure, sudden anger, and the feeling of being shoved or scratched. Now, unlike Eastern State Penitentiary, there really aren't any famous names tied to Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, but one legend centers on a former boxer whose injuries left him volatile. During confinement, he reportedly tore a heavy metal door from its hinges, damaging the steel, before calmly just handing it off to a nurse and returning to his room. The isolation spaces connected to this story often have reports of voices saying phrases like "get me out" or "let me go" with sudden temperature changes. Today, the asylum functions as a both historical site and paranormal destination, and as I mentioned before, tours are designed to educate, but the stories carry emotional weight that goes beyond dates and architecture. The contrast between the institution's original intent and the reality of what unfolded inside gives the legends their power. Visitors often describe sensations they can just not fully articulate. A chill without cold, a touch without a source, a sense that someone noticed them first. Trans-Allegheny does not present itself as a place of clear answers. Its legends are layered, sometimes contradictory, and often unresolved. What remains consistent is the impression that the building remembers. Whether those memories take form of spirits, residual energy, or psychological projection depends on who is listening. But few leave without feeling that the stories here are not finished being told. These stories are the echoes of lives once lived here, lingering in ways that history alone cannot capture. The story of Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is one of stark contradictions, where intent and outcome rarely align. The Kirkbride philosophy emphasized light, fresh air, and the opportunity for patients to walk the grounds. Yet the reality of the institution's history diverged sharply from these ideals, and it happened fast. What was meant to heal frequently harmed. All of these contradictions underline a broader theme here. Good intentions alone were not enough to counter systematic failings in an institution where human needs vastly exceeded available resources. Social contradictions were equally present. The asylum was both a sanctuary and a cage, a place for the mentally ill yet housed people for reasons that were far from psychiatric. The line between illness and social conformity blurred, raising questions about who the institution served. The patients, or society's notion of order. Even in death, the asylum carries paradoxical echoes. Spirits, as reported by visitors and caretakers, are simultaneously playful, mournful, aggressive, and benign. Lily, the child spirit, embodies innocence preserved within the sight of suffering, while Dean's presence recalls violence and pain. The same walls that once promised reform now generate fear, empathy, and fascination. The building is at once a monument to care and a testament to failure. Ultimately, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum embodies a duality that defines its legacy. Now, while mental reform was at the forefront, the regional and national politics of the time also played a big role in Trans-Allegheny. Funding and staffing were inconsistent, leaving caretakers overworked and underpaid, which compounded problems that were already beyond the structure. The asylum's isolation in rural West Virginia meant that the oversight was minimal, and the abuses, both intentional and systematic, went largely unchallenged. Once you were in, there was very little contact to the outside world. This geographic and bureaucratic isolation helped shape the extreme conditions that later fueled the hauntings and dark reputations of the facility, and overshadowed what the building was originally intended for. Another often overlooked layer is the humanity of the patients themselves. While the asylum's narrative emphasizes suffering, chaos, and cruelty, personal accounts reveal moments of connection, creativity, and resilience. Patients did form bonds. They celebrated holidays together and sometimes found ways to maintain a sense of identity despite the oppressive system. The treatment of women and children adds another dimension that is often understated. Pregnant women, mothers, and children were present, sometimes living their entire lives within the institution. Their experiences illustrate not only the failures of the asylum as a therapeutic space, but also how systematic neglect intersected with vulnerability, gender expectations, and societal judgment. Imagine being locked up because you read a book too fast. Finally, the post-closure history of Trans-Allegheny is often simplified to ghost stories or paranormal curiosity. What is overlooked here is the careful preservation work, research, and the educational programming that recontextualize this building. Tours and investigations provide insight into the broader history of mental health care, societal norms, and the ethical evolution of psychiatric treatment at the time, reminding visitors that the asylum's legacy is both spectral and profoundly human. These overlooked contexts deepen the story, revealing that the asylum was more than its walls or its horrors. It was a reflection of the society that created it, a complex intersection of care, control, and consequence. A visit to Trans-Allegheny often leaves more questions than answers. You may notice movement just outside your field of vision, hear footsteps where no one is walking, or feel a sudden shift in the air. Or you may experience nothing at all. Just floorboards settling, wind moving through broken windows, and the quiet weight of stone just filling the space. Every reaction is different, shaped by the building's architecture, its history, and the lives spent within its walls. Whether what people experience is presence, memory, or expectation is left unresolved. That uncertainty is what has earned Trans-Allegheny its reputation as one of the most haunted locations in America. Not because of what it shows you, but because of what it leaves behind. In the next episode, the season finale, we board a vessel unlike any other, where the ghosts of the sea are said to walk the decks and the past drifts along the present. We'll explore the RMS Queen Mary, a ship whose elegance masks stories of tragedy, mystery, and lingering spirits. From the sounds of footsteps in the empty corridors to the shadows that vanish when approached, the Queen Mary reminds us that history doesn't always sail quietly. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. Thanks for listening.
Paranormal Unsettled is written and produced by Johnny Clash. Want more unsettling content? Subscribe to Johnny Clash XP on YouTube and Paranormal Unsettled on TikTok. For gaming content, follow on Twitch and social media at Johnny FN Clash.
subscribe.